If you would like to earn CPE credit for listening to the show, visit earmarkcpe.com/FPA. Download the app, take a short quiz, and get your CPE certificate. If you would like to earn continuing education credit for your FP&A certification from the Association of Finance Professionals for listening to the show, go to the show notes for details on how to earn the credit. Finally, if you enjoy listening to FP&A Today, please go to your podcast platform of choice, click the subscribe button, and leave a rating and review of the show. And now, on to the show.
From Data Rails, this is FP&A Today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FP&A Today. I am your host, Paul Barnhurst, aka the FP&A Guy, and you are listening to FP&A Today. FP&A Today is brought to you by Data Rails, financial planning and analysis platform for Excel users. Every week, we welcome a leader from the world of financial planning and analysis and discuss some of the biggest stories and challenges in the world of FP&A. We'll provide you with actionable advice about financial planning and analysis. This is going to be your go-to resource for everything FP&A. I am thrilled to welcome today's guest on the show, Mikus Krams. Mikus, welcome to the show.
Hi, good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So he comes to us from Latvia. He currently works as the co-founder at Trace.space, and he earned his bachelor's and master's degree from Rotterdam School of Management. So if I could have you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, just if you could introduce yourself to our audience.
So I studied my bachelor's and master's in Rotterdam. I did my master's in finance. After that, I went to investment banking in London for a few years. Then more recently went to back home to Latvia, did a bit of VC, did my, let's say, first startup, which failed and didn't go anywhere. Then joined Localize as the very early employee, looking after finance and operations. So I'm trying to figure out, how to make everything work in this high growth environment. And then more recently, I was at Chili Pepper, which is another B2B Saas company, and as well kind of initially looking after revenue planning, but then more broadly after finance and a bit of strategy. And and so now I, since kind of end of January, started my own business with two other co-founders in the requirements management space. So it's another B2B SaaS company. That's what I've been doing. That's what I love.
It sounds like you have a love for the startup space, those early day companies, and B2B SaaS. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct. But it felt really exciting, and I kind of never got out of it. So I've been thrilled to be here.
Well, good. I'm glad it's worked out for you. That's what we all want to find, is something we love doing. So, it looks like you started your career working in transactions and restructuring. That's kind of investment banking. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that experience and what that was like?
So before I went into banking, I did a year in KPMG in transactions advisory. That it taught me a few good things, but I thought the pace was a bit slow. So I went back to do my master's and then jumped into banking. Actually, I found banking is obviously challenging because the work hours are pretty brutal, and there's a lot of work. You kind of prioritize work all the way. But it did teach me a lot. It's not just the technical skills, but also the emotions of going through these large transactions, and the entrepreneurs. They it could be something that they work their whole life for, and then suddenly they come to this transaction and they're selling the company, and it's really, really exciting. And honestly, I would recommend anyone young and ambitious to go through those a few years, and it's just the best school ever.
Great. No, thanks for sharing that experience there. It sounds like you learned a lot in that investment banking space, and it helped prepare you for what you're doing today. So it sounds like a good experience.
Absolutely.
Sounds like on the transaction side, you kind of recognized what you didn't want to be doing long-term. Wasn't quite the right pace for what you like doing. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's quite fair. I think the professional services companies are very good at setting a sort of a ladder that you can climb. Mm-hmm. But the trade-off, and they train you and they take care of you, they can raise your salary a bit every year. But the trade-off is that if you want to grow faster, then it's very hard to jump over the steps in the ladder. And so you gotta find a way where that's possible. And startups tend to be the place. But yeah, I think for anyone starting, it gives you such a broad overview and such a you can try so many things, learn so many items. It's really helpful.
Thanks for elaborating on that. And that makes sense to me. I would agree. Yeah, very structured. Where startup, right? Roles can be changing a lot. There's, you know, your title may be one thing, but you're doing something different. It's changing every day, right? High paced, constant movement. And so speaking of that, obviously you just co-founded a company, Trace.space. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how you came to found the company and what you guys do?
What we're building is essentially the new next generation of requirements management, which is this. It's a category within product lifecycle management. When you're building complex hardware plus software products, you need to the process a bit more challenging than agile, and very often you're not able to build things in the agile methodology, and so you need to write out all the requirements beforehand, and then you need to follow. You need to trace them through. So you have to make sure that everything happens as you said it would, and you need to test these things through, and it's all these. It's kind of a very complex process. And personally, my two other co-founders, they were in this industry before, and so they kind of have a lot of that earned knowledge. I came from outside, so I was the only one that didn't know anything about it. And initially, it took me a couple of months to get convinced that this is a, let's say, worthy endeavor. But
Mm-hmm.
actually, the more I dug into it, then I saw that it's actually these amazing systems engineers that build some of the coolest products in the world. They're actually using something that's very, very outdated, and we just saw this is somebody has to help them. You know somebody has to do something here, and so we decided it has to be us. And it's one of those boring and complex industries, but we wear that as a badge of honor because it means nobody else was tackling it, and it's worth tackling. So
Great. Thanks for sharing a little bit more on the story there. And sounds like it took a little while for you to get comfortable with the idea, different space, which can be rewarding and challenging at the same time as you have to learn, a new space as you're doing a new company. So previous to Trace.space at Chili Pepper, and you were the director of revenue planning. Can you talk a little bit about that experience? I know you had a couple different roles, but just in particular, kind of what it was like being over revenue planning.
so revenue, actually, the way I joined Chili Piper was with the CEO Nicholas, co-CEO Nicholas. We I kind of said that I'm looking for a new role, and I spoke to him, and then we kind of discussed how we think about what planning is, what does it mean, how it should work. And I think he saw that our views are quite aligned. And the methodology that he called is AO, so it's kind of splitting it into three components. So the whole planning process is split into three components: so actions, yields, expected outcomes. And actions is pretty much anything that you do. That it could be things like hiring an SDR, improving your marketing stats, launching ads. And then so that's something you actually do. And then yields is, what does that actually yield? So every SDR, so sales development representative, can be yielding 6 to 10 meetings per month. And so you measure how much actually was achieved. And then expected outcome is kind of what you expect out of that. And then you measure, first of all, whether you did the action, so whether you hired this SDR, and the second, how many meetings did they actually achieve. And so that kind of creates that actions yields expected outcome model, which is quite different from budgeting, but that's how we did it. And that's what my job was, is not to figure out what people will be doing, but is actually to gather this data. So I went into every business leader to ask, what are you planning to do in the next quarter, in the next year? What do you think that's going to yield? And so we put it all together in a single model, and that's how we figured out what the revenue is going to be like.
It sounds like a bottoms up approach based on what actions are you going to perform, what's the yield you expect from those actions, and what's the outcome from those yields, and then you would measure against that.
Yep, that's exactly right. I think the fundamental piece is that you split it in two. So it's not like you say, oh, well, we underperformed in outbound because the SDRs didn't do something. It's actually, first of all, you check whether you actually did the actions. So, okay, we actually didn't make the hires. They're just not yielding this. Or we actually, they're not yielding. They're yielding everything correctly, we just didn't actually make the hires that we said we would. So it's kind of the logic it comes out is very, very different because you really try to split out these two things.
Got it. So when you're measuring it, you're really trying to measure it in two areas. You're trying to measure, did we do the actions? And if we did the actions, did we get the results from those actions we expected?
That's correct.
And so then you can tell, okay, the shortfall's due to our actions, or the shortfall's due to our assumptions on what those actions would yield.
That's correct.
And so how did you find that approach worked? What did you see as kind of the benefits of, kind of planning it and looking at it that way?
For me personally, I feel that that's probably the only right way to do things at the early stage if you're growing fast, because it's really hard to know what your life is going to be like even in the next 3 months, and that's just an inherent part of the growth process. So if you think about the company's life cycle, at first you kind of go from we know nothing and everything is possible all the way to, let's say, being a public company and paying earnings per share in a very predictable way. And in that process, you grow and eventually you plateau. And when you plateau in your growth, you start focusing more on items that are lower in your P&L, right? So initially, your valuation is only based on revenue growth. Then it's on, let's say, gross profit. Then it's on EBITDA. And then it's on net income and EPS and so on. What I observed is that the way you grow is you try to figure out what are predictable items that you can do. So let's take, for example, the same SDRs or paid ads. After a while, once you hired enough SDRs, you hit a ceiling and you can't actually, even if you hire some more, you're just not going to get any more opportunities in that month. So it means you hit the ceiling and it's just a question of getting them more efficient. And so it kind of creates your baseline of outcomes. And then on top of that, you just keep experimenting. That's how you create this layer cake of your go-to-market of your revenue, of like things that are predictable, things that are unpredictable, and you try to make sure that over time you layer many, many predictable things to kind of grow your revenue.
I like what you've said there. And I mean, as you were saying that, I was relating that to my own business, right? Like an action might be, I launch a digital course. What do I expect from that? Okay, if I had an expectation, it's one of two things that caused my shortfall. Either I didn't launch the course or I didn't achieve the targets I thought I would with launching it, right? And then I can go back to the drawing board, okay, and say, okay, what actions do I need to do to increase that yield, right? What are the actions I'm going to take this month? And I can, again, measure against that. Say, okay, did I do that? Did I do the advertising? Did I do a referral program? Whatever it might be. And I can see at a very small level, especially, kind of a business of one, which is my case, how it would be very easy to lay things out like that. We often think that way and we don't think of it as planning, but that's what it is. You don't think of it as, budgeting. It's not really a budget. You're not setting a budget, but you're planning. So that makes a lot of sense to me, what you've said there. I could see where that approach could be really helpful, especially in those early days. So next I want to talk about, you wrote an article last year. It was titled Why We Don't Have Budgets.
Yep.
And so, obviously that's a subject that's near and dear to a lot of people in FP&A's heart. So can you talk a little bit about how the article came about?
Well, first of all, we were doing things differently. We figured that we are doing things differently, and we obviously believe that it to be a better way of doing things. And so Nicholas decided to write about this company of the future that we're building. And every kind of business leader was writing about their own. So, for example, the head of sales, he wrote about why we don't do discounts at Chili Piper. And so for me, it was writing about my work is why we don't do budgets and why kind of budgets is a dirty word at Chili Piper.
Interesting. And so, can you talk about why didn't you guys do budgets? Maybe can you just talk a little bit about, what led to that, that determination that there was a different and, better approach for you guys?
So we felt that budgets actually come from very large companies, and probably very large companies, it does make a lot of sense. But the inherent problem is that the budget, first of all, let's say you're doing some activity and it's yielding you some result. If halfway through the activity you figure that it's not working, why would you still keep pushing it? But if you have a budget, that's exactly what you do. You let it play out all the way, even if you know already that it's not working. And the same thing, if actually you start doing something, you realize that this is giving you a large return, but you're not going to invest more because you say, oh, well, we're out of budget, and you have to wait until the next quarter or even the next year to actually do more of what you already know works. And so it just felt silly to be living that way. And I've heard from other people in other companies where, let's say, they figured, oh, well, we have a problem because we're data blind. Okay, so let's get a data tool, and then so we budget $5,000 for it, but it turns out that the data tool costs $7,000, and so now, oh, well, are we really not going to buy a data tool because it costs $7,000 instead of five? But that's exactly what budgets will do, and that's exactly what happened in that company. So, but at the same time, everybody says, "Oh, well, we're struggling because we're blind. We don't know the data, but yet we can't spend an extra $2,000 on this tool." So that's the kind of logic that just didn't make sense to us. So it's every time you see everything that you do, you figure out whether that has a positive return or not. And if it has a positive return, then let's invest. And if it doesn't, then let's not even invest $1 in it. And I think the other sort of good thing is that it gives people a lot of ownership and responsibility. So because if it's not like you say, hey, here's $10,000, do what you can. You're actually saying, here's nothing, here's zero. And unless you tell me what you think you're going to do and how that's going to yield results, you're not going to get anything. So then suddenly people are like, actually, well, there's a lot of cool things I want to try. And they, the discussion is just much more rich, and there's so many initiatives, and because people know that they're not restricted by some budget, they know that if something interesting comes up, they're able to execute on it because after discussion they'll actually get the resources that they need.
Thanks for sharing that. One thing I found really interesting is the article, you started out with the first line saying, if you're an agile or fast moving company, which obviously a big mature company isn't, right, as a general rule, an agile, fast moving company, a budget is like a shackle. You'll be held prisoner to the assumptions you make for the next year. Can you maybe, I think you've talked a little bit about that, but can you break that down just a little further for us, what you meant by that statement?
Let's say you're planning to grow 100%, right? So, which, okay, nowadays maybe a bit more challenged, but that's kind of what the startups are looking at every year. If you're saying you're going to grow at 100%, it means that you're going to deliver the same amount of revenue. So you're going to grow the same amount of revenue as you've done for all of your past years together, right? If you're going from 5 to 10, let's say you grew to 5 million of ARR over 3 years, you're going to say, in this 1 year, we're going to do exactly the same. So, but you don't actually, so of course, the linear things, you know how much like each SDR is going to yield, but that's because you know that from your first 5 million, but for the next 5 million, that yield is probably going to change. But if you're saying that that's still going to work as you go from 5 to 10, then you're probably going to run into trouble towards the second half of the year because suddenly those assumptions don't hold true anymore, and you have to figure some things out. And so either halfway through the year you already know you're going to fail in your, let's say, forecast, and you do nothing. You're just gonna. So what do you do the second half of the year? Do you just live in misery, or do you try to figure out a better way? So that's the whole point, is that you need to have your eyes open every day and look around and see what's happening and reevaluate all the time, not just once a year at the budget meeting.
Got it. So just, kind of a couple questions. So obviously you don't have budgets, but is there a high level kind of plan or target going into the year that you want to achieve? And then you basically throughout the year use, I think, what you called the ROI mindset to decide what to invest in to achieve that? Or how do I think about, because obviously you got investors, there has to be some targets, there's some planning that goes on, but maybe can you walk through, how you do that connection from that plan to the way you deal with this, forecasting approach?
Of course. So there's definitely targets, but I think the important part is that the targets. So let's say fundamentally there's two approaches, right? Let's say top down, where investors, CEO gives you a number and say you got to hit it, and then you just backsell that, which I don't think it fundamentally works, but it gives you a direction of travel. So you say, okay, well, we kind of want to get to that 100%. Let's see what we got to do. But then the real work is the bottoms up, and it's not actually. So we have targets, but the targets are not given by finance or the CEO. the targets are figured out by the business leaders themselves. So the head of sales says, okay, well, how much can I deliver? The head of marketing, they actually give the numbers to me, and I just put them together in a model. So it's important also because I don't want to be. It's not me forcing this something onto them because I don't know. I'm not. If I was as good as they are in their respective fields, then I'd be doing that. But I'm not. So I'm doing the finance piece. I'm just putting it all together. But it's their numbers and it's their sense of ownership that they know that. Okay, well, we discuss them. We figure out, okay, is this realistic? Maybe this can be pushed higher. So there is this discussion, but in essence, it's they own the numbers, so they set the targets and they deliver against their own targets, not against my targets.
Got it. So it sounds like, if I'm hearing this right, the way to think about it is, one, it's the bottoms up approach. You get to that target or what you think you're going to achieve. You have a plan that you can measure against. So, hey, January, based on what everybody's given us, we think we can get to 1 million. But throughout the year, you're really not worrying about that initial budget. You're making each decision based on, hey, is this a good return? Let's look at the ROI on that. And, that initial target is just that. It's a target. Whatever makes sense now, that's what we focus on, versus what you often see companies very focused on. Okay, we got to get back to the budget. Here's the budget. It's not in the budget, so we can't do it, or we got to find the money from somewhere else. And so it's really a mindset shift with a planning
Yes.
process focused on a constant return on investment. Is that the way to think of it?
Yeah, it's exactly right. I think the bigger challenge is that when you ask that of your executives, they also need to be mindful that, say, they don't actually, okay, they don't have to deliver 100% year-on-year growth. They can do 20% year-on-year growth. But they need to be mindful that if that's what they're aiming for, then their equity is going to be worth much less. So their options are going to be worth much less, and their bonuses and so on. So it's kind of making sure that people are very aware of the context and like what is valued by, let's say, the investor community. And it's that kind of, so you have to work with them as well. So you can't just say, give me some numbers and that's it. You have to say, well, okay, you're telling me this. It's likely that if we deliver that, then the implication is something else. So it's this ROI mindset, and it's giving people a lot of everything that they could possibly need in order to make good decisions. The other kind of aspect of the ROI mindset is that there's never a shortage of money. It's not about whether we have cash, it's about the cost of capital. So there's always more money out there. Sometimes you might have to, saw off your hand, but it's there. It's always there, and it might be excessively expensive, but it's never a closed market. I mean, that doesn't happen if you're a startup. And it's just that, again, everything is possible. It just has a cost to it. So you do this balanced equation. You do, how much can we grow? What is it going to cost us? If we grow faster, that's going to cost us maybe more because we need to get more resources. That's expensive. But it's really having this balance, since as every turn you try to figure out what is we can do more, but what is it going to cost us, and is it worth it? It's like building a portfolio of projects. So that's the analogy.
Which makes sense when you mention kind of that ROI mindset, return on investment, because it's often how you think of portfolios. What's the return? And it feels like, as a finance person, there's a lot of education you do here. It's like, okay, we can grow at 20%, but that means, the equity you have is going to be worth 40% of what, you expected when you came in, based on kind of the original plan we put together. And so it feels a little bit like almost a continuous planning with a portfolio ROI mindset. So not, obviously you're not throwing out the whole process and saying, hey, we don't need a plan. Just come to us when you have a good idea and let's see what it looks like. They're still measuring and performance, but it's very much an ownership mindset, a bottom down. And let's not be beholden to something we set up that, frankly, in most companies, the day the budget's finished, it's not achievable, right? Because
Exactly.
things have changed.
Or it's easily achievable. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it's whatever number you finished with, it's almost to a certain extent often irrelevant when you're done.
That's exactly right.
Right. For better or worse.
Yep.
And so I can see that. I've always been a fan of more of a rolling forecast approach. And it's just figuring out how you manage the incentives. And so a little bit around that, because, right, budget, I think a big part of why budget is set up the way it is, for better or worse, is the incentive structure, right? It's okay, these are the numbers I need to achieve. And if I get them, I know I'm going to get a big bonus. So I don't care about anything else. It's just getting to that number. So how did you guys manage kind of, the incentive structure without having the budget, that kind of formal budget process in place? How was that thought about?
I'll split this answer probably in two parts, but the less cynical part is trying to take this. There's a lot of what I personally like is kind of this RevOps approach, is that you try to really break down what each person is responsible for, like what is their conversion rate. You can only pay people based on things they can actually have an effect on.
Mm-hmm.
And so you try to isolate what that effect is, but also ask them only to do those specific things. So maybe on a specific example, again, let's go back to the SDRs, the sales development representatives.
Sure.
What companies often would do, they would say, here's here's a laptop, here's a bit of a salary, just go get some meetings, right? But the problem is that there's no scalability. You don't know what works. So there's scalability, but there's no predictability. Mm-hmm. And so if you wanted to add a third, a fourth, a fifth, you wouldn't know because you would just give them a laptop. So what do? You tell them, here's an account list, a specific sort of named accounts that you're going to go after. And your responsibility is to book meetings. Whether those meetings are of good quality is the responsibility of the person who created the account list, not the SDR themselves. So, and then in that scenario, you can pay them for meetings booked. And if somebody comes back and says, actually, all the meetings that you booked were of low quality, then you go back to the system, you go back to the manager, you go back to the account list, but you don't go back to the SDR because they are actually doing exactly what you told them to do. So it's that kind of slight mindset shift that you say, okay, well, can you have an effect on this? Yes or no? And then so we pay you based on that. So that's the practical advice. The cynical advice is that all targets are a mirage, because I think finance teams all over the world know very well that the targets can be a little bit above, the target can be a little bit below. The question is, for me, targets are about what kind of culture do you want? Do you want a culture where we're always a little bit behind and we're always struggling, or a culture where everybody's always winning a little bit and we're all happy? And it's just a never-ending process of trying to. I don't think targets are they're not a performance management tool. They're more like a cultural management tool. It's sort of, where do we end up, all of us together? Are we happy? Are we not? And because like we saw in the last years, a lot of companies, what they started doing for sales, for example, they started promising huge OTs, so on target earnings. But they already knew that those earnings are not achievable because maybe half the team only ever gets to that level. So again, it's a mirage, and it's whether you do that on purpose or by accident, but hopefully you do it on purpose, because then you're clearly trying to achieve some goal. And so,
yeah, I like your example there of on-target earnings, right? You see, so often when you dig into it, you say, okay, OTE could be 300,000, right? Whatever, just throwing out a number. And then you ask, well, how many people were above OTE? 2%. Okay, so 98% was below. So what was the average? And the average is like 160. So what you're telling me is I have almost zero chance of earning on OTE. So what,
exactly right.
Why? Then there's usually some kind of reason. So I do like how you said you want to try to create, quick wins. And I can understand, both approaches, the cynical that you mentioned and the non-cynical with targets. And, I've always felt that that's probably one of the biggest things, is how to, best decouple targets from budgets to go to more of a continuous planning approach.
Yeah.
Because I definitely think there's some benefits of having that. Doesn't mean you don't plan. It doesn't mean you don't have, targets and incentives and all the things that you do with a budget. It just changes the mindset and the approach. At least that's how I kind of think about it. You know what it is like. 13 different spreadsheets emailed out to 23 different budget holders. multiple iterations, version control, errors, back and forth updates. You never really feel in control of the consolidation and collection process. Yep, I've been there. Stop, breathe. DataRails is the financial planning and analysis platform for Excel users. DataRails takes data from all your company's disparate sources. No organization is too complex, consolidating everything into one place, secured in the cloud. Now all your data finally talking to each other. Everything is automated back into your report in Excel. Cash flow, FX conversion, intercompany transactions, now automated and up to date. Drill down and variance analysis in seconds. Don't replace Excel, embrace Excel. Turn your Excel into a lean, mean FP&A machine. Find out more at www.datarails.com. One other thing I wanted to ask you about from the article. So, you talked about two distinct types of managers and kind of some pros and cons to each of them. And I really liked what you mentioned. In this frame, you said there's the manager that's the powder keg and the manager that's the sniper. Could you explain that analogy, what you meant by that, and kind of what the difference is between those managers and maybe the benefits and challenges they create?
So actually, that's just to also kind of mention it's a framework borrowed from Matt Robinson, who's at Nested now, I think. And the other caveat is that also both of these, let's say, categories of managers, that it applies to competent managers. So putting aside lack of competency, let's just focus on those two, just on competent people. So the powder kegs are the ones where you light the fuse and they just explode in every possible direction. So you hire them, they're competent, they're excited, they know exactly what to do. They come in, they set up the processes, they buy the right tools, they hire the right people, all these good little things. And the first 90 days is just a wild ride of progress and all these kind of, you get educated because they're telling you what you've been doing wrong the whole time. And I think that sounds all good, but the problem is they never stop to think whether the company needs that. So they need that as managers to prove themselves, and let's say their department needs those things, but whether the company needs them right now is, I think, still a question mark. And that's where sort of the snipers come in. So they are aware that there's all these things that they could be doing. So the processes, the hires, the tools, but they take a bit of pause and try to understand whether the company needs this right now, or maybe it's something we do in 12 months. So the example I mentioned is NetSuite. So, you're coming in as a new CFO. It's easy to say, what I'm going to do, nothing works until I implement NetSuite. So I'm going to do that for 12 months and then talk to me again. But the reality is maybe that's not necessary. Maybe QuickBooks is just fine. Just keep working with that. And then when it really starts hurting, then you go to NetSuite. But just be mindful that is a large endeavor. And I think the problem is that as a senior leader, you really have to trust these snipers and not say, hey, it looks like you're not doing anything. It's just, no, they're deliberately avoiding doing things not to distract the company as such. So
thank you for that analogy. And when I first, read this article, it reminded me a little bit. I worked for a large bank, and they were talking about us versus another bank. And they're like, one, when making a decision, one just points and points and points, like, very deliberate. And the other one just points and shoots, which is a little bit like the powder keg. It's like, all right, we see the problem, just go tackle it, whether it makes sense or not, whether it's the right timing, because it's a problem. And so you just kind of run off and start, solving them. And there's not always the strategic to it, where the sniper, it's very deliberate. And you may not always see what they're doing up front, but over time, you start to realize, okay, the progress is being made. It's just being done in the right way, in the right pace, versus just being done everywhere, so to speak.
Yep, exactly. And I think coming back to the context of the ROI mindset and the budgets and all those things, if you assume that money is infinite or it just has a cost, the one thing that is not infinite is executive attention and just like headspace, right? So if there's just too many things in your head, it's not possible physically to put more things in. And so that's why sometimes you really have to figure out what are the things we're not going to do, because it's just not worth the headspace for us right now. So I think it's really actually important to really, really focus on. And actually, what I loved was there was this video, and somebody was talking about how Steve Jobs said that prioritization is not doing things you don't want to do. It's actually not doing the things that you really, really want to do. And that's, again, comes back. You have to evaluate, is this a worthy distraction or not?
Yeah. And, I've been learning that the hard way in a business. I've had more opportunity than I ever expected. And I want to take all of them. And I've been slowly getting better at like, no, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't fit to who I am. Just close that door. Is, a good mentor of mine put it, strategy is about closing doors, right? It's about limiting down the opportunities and being laser focused on what you need to do. And when the times are right, yeah, she'll occasionally open doors, but more often it's about, closing out the noise and staying focused than it is about opening up a bunch of doors and running through all of them.
Yep, absolutely right.
I can totally relate to that both on a personal level and just, professionally in my experience. So I appreciate that. So last question around, the budgeting process. And I've enjoyed this discussion. It's given me something to, to think about. And I think there's, definitely a lot of similarities with what you're doing to the idea of the budget process. Well, kind of unshackling the things that make the budget process less than ideal. Taking apart that target and recognizing that, look, having a number at the beginning of the year isn't maybe the best way to approach this, especially if we're growing fastly. We need to be nimble. So I've enjoyed this discussion. Let's say somebody listening wants to implement kind of the approach that you've talked about. What would you recommend, for them? How would you recommend they try going about that or getting started?
I think the best way is to increase the cadence of, in this case, rebudgeting. So if you're budgeting yearly, try to do it quarterly. If you're budgeting quarterly, try to do it monthly. Monthly might be a bit tough. So what you can do is just try to re-budget bits and pieces of the business. So if something is very predictable, it always does the same thing, and you've kind of hit the ceiling, and so you know exactly how it works, don't touch it, just let it work. But if there are things that you don't know, then you want to experiment with, just re-budget those and add them into the plan. So I think that's the best way. It's really increasing the cadence of your evaluation.
So it feels like, if I'm hearing it right, it's really kind of moving more and more to that continuous forecasting methodology where you're on constantly revisiting your numbers, right? And what about mindset? What about if people are struggling with this idea, this ROI mindset? Any advice around kind of that shift?
I think on a practical level, the best way is to have the finance team educate the leadership, the rest of the leaders, or if the people are ready to listen, do that. I did that for my personally as well. We had town halls, and maybe once every 6 months, I would actually prepare some slides and explain how valuations work, how the P&L works, what we're doing with the forecasting, just to give people context on what we're up to here. I think that gives people suddenly they're like, oh, I understand why we're putting these numbers together. I understand what they mean. I understand how they play into the larger organization. It's just this transparency and education, not education, just letting people, showing them what's inside the FP&A department, showing them why you're doing those things and why they matter and how it works together. I think that's very, very helpful.
Thank you for sharing that. That makes a lot of sense. Being transparent, sharing with what's going on and making sure everybody's on the same page and they understand the philosophy and thinking. So, moving on here, we have a few kind of standard questions we'd like to ask everybody. So I'd like to, kind of move forward with those. And the first one here that we like to ask is, can you describe a time you have experienced a failure? And the reason I like to ask that is I look at failures as a learning experience. So maybe a failure you had at work and what you learned from the experience, what it taught you.
So I think especially in my more recent, let's say, financial planning career, I think the failure that had one of the biggest effects was I kind of pushed this, I'm just here to gather the data. I'm not here to push targets on anyone. I kind of pushed it maybe a bit too far. And so what I did is I when I was producing this analysis, I would just put the slide decks, I put all the right things on there, but I wouldn't actually call them out and say, hey, everybody, please make sure you pay attention to this, because I just assume that everybody knows and they'll notice the right things. And it kind of, yeah, it kind of led to some people suddenly being, hey, like I didn't realize this has been happening for a few months, right? And I said, well, it's in my slides. But yes, that's true, it is in my slides, but that's not helpful. It's really, if that's important, it's my job to actually call it out and to actually seek solutions and try to understand what's happening before somebody else actually calls it out. And I think that was one of the things where it was hard to sort of say, oh, well, it was there for myself, because yes, it was there, but at the same time, the I had produced the output, but I hadn't ensured the outcome, and that was something that, yeah, I had to learn a bit the hard way.
Thank you for sharing that. And I can see where that's a learning experience where it's like, okay, it's my job to just present the information to them and they'll kind of figure it out from there, versus help giving them the insights and things they needed so that they make sure they were aware of potential changes that were happening. So appreciate you sharing that one. Next question here. Moving forward, what do you see as the biggest opportunity and challenge for FP&A?
I think the biggest opportunity is bringing in people who have never been part of the FP&A process. So, if you kind of push it, of course, the head of sales, the VP of sales has always been part of the process. But I think with improved tooling and kind of ease of use, you can include not just maybe managers, but actually individual salespeople, saying they give their individual forecast that gets aggregated up to the common forecast. I think that's a great opportunity where really, yeah, it just you'll have better outcomes because people will be more involved. I think that the challenge on the flip side of that is that obviously that kind of system is complicated to set up, and there's a lot of data and there's data hygiene and whatnot. And so again, in order to do that, you're going to have some very smart data people that can really set it up, that not only understand data piping, but they also understand the business side of things. And I think that can probably take easily a year to get that growing. But
Sure.
I think once you do get there, it's great, but it'll be challenging.
Thanks for sharing that. And I could definitely see where, everybody having ownership for their number, there's definitely advantages to that, and being able to have that very granular kind of bottoms up. And I could also see how that's a big challenge, right? That's a long process, a lot of data. So I appreciate you sharing that one. Next question here, and this is one we like to ask everybody, is what is something unique about you that you can share with our audience?
Something you probably unique or interesting is that I've lived in 6-7 countries and on 3 continents, so I've seen a lot, and I think that's quite unique, because when I was living in Geneva in the international school, everybody was doing that, and everybody had lived in so many other places and speaking so many languages. But when I moved to other places, I realized that actually that is quite unique, and it's kind of a relatively small privileged group to be able to see all those things in the world.
I know for myself, I've lived in one country, lived in a couple different places within that one country, and I've traveled to other countries, but so I can definitely say that's unique from, my experience, and most people I know to have lived in 5-6 countries. I have a few friends that have lived in, a lot of different countries, but not many. So I would say that's unique. Next one. This is a question we ask everybody. Our sponsor is Data Rails. They're big fans of Excel. So we like to ask, what is your favorite Excel feature, function, formula? Your favorite thing about Excel?
So if I want to sound smart, I say offset. But in reality, it's VLOOKUP and pivot tables. That's like, if those are my favorites, because it tends to be that you kind of, there's a large data set that I need to get an answer. I just download it and I pivot it, I VLOOK it up, and then I get my answer. So that's the reality. Those are 2 of my favorite functions.
Well, you're in good company, because I know those are 2 of our top 3 answers we get from people. I know VLOOKUP and pivot tables are both right at the top. Yeah. I can't remember if they're 1 and 2 or 2 and 3, but
they just work and they do the job. So
they do. Lookups, whether it's VLOOKUP, index match, whatever lookup you're using, lookups and summarizing your data they're at the top of the list, and VLOOKUP and pivot table do that. So I think everybody can appreciate that. So let's assume somebody's starting their career today in FP&A. What advice would you give them?
So I'd say if you haven't started your career yet in FP&A and you're still thinking about it, I would say do that. Do the banking route, do the consulting route. I think you learn a lot. A lot of those trainings are super expensive, and the companies pay for them, so you're just learning on somebody else's dime. So and the professional skills you learn, they're very valuable, and the work ethic, just do that. If you're actually already in it, I would say try to learn data. That's something I haven't done, to be honest, but I think the sooner you're comfortable, let's say, stepping out of whatever Excel can do and being able to do SQL, I think it will just kind of very, very helpful in the future. On a more professional skill level, what I've found to be very, very helpful is actually have lunch or just have chats with the business leaders. So really get to know them, like how do they think about it? How do they see you? And the next thing to do is also have the same lunches and chats, not just with the leaders, but also the individual contributors. Because then you can see how someone saying, we got to deliver 100 this quarter, how that gets translated to the leaders, and then how that gets translated to the individual contributors. And that message is not a linear. There's all these sort of noise in the middle, and the way that people see it is very, very different from how it actually gets translated into you. So it's kind of, and I actually learned this in forensics. I had one forensics project, is that you gotta ask the same question to different types of people, and then you actually see how information travels through the organization.
Yeah, when you said that, I don't know if you've ever played the game Telephone.
Yeah, it's exactly
As
that.
a kid, the idea was, right, you say something, you give it to the next person, and by the time 10 people have heard it, what they said is almost completely different than what person one said. So that whole translation. So yeah, the more you can get to know the different people in the business, the more you can understand the challenges and how different people are putting their own filter on it and translating what's going on, and allows you to provide greater insight and, help create value for the business. So I really like that one. And, good point. I think a lot of people, that have come to FP&A have come from a banking route. So it's definitely something people consider, the consulting or the banking. And then very last question here. If someone wants to learn more about you or get a hold of you, what is the best way for them to contact you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most active on. My handle proudly is linkedin.com/in/ebida. It's been for a few years, so that's how you find me.
I didn't realize it was IM. I think I may have saw that when I was looking, but that's great. Yeah, I snagged the FP&A guy, so that's my handle for LinkedIn. So I had a little fun too. Yeah, it's always good when you can get a unique handle like that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed chatting with you and, spending a few minutes, and we'll let you go so you can enjoy your evening. I think it's probably about 7, 8 o'clock for you now.
Yeah, 8 o'clock. Yeah,
8 o'clock. So we'll let you enjoy your night. But thank you again for joining us. And I look forward to our audience, listening to this.